May 2nd, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The Queen of England woke to what seemed like an ordinary spring morning. By noon, everything would be gone. Within hours, Anne Boleyn would be arrested on charges of adultery and treason. Within days, she would face trial. Within weeks, she would be dead. That morning, she believed her intelligence and years with the king would protect her. The story of how England's most powerful woman fell to a condemned prisoner in just 17 days is one of the most brutal tales in British history. The girl who came back from France. Anne wasn't born to be queen. She was born around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn, a diplomat with ambition and connections, but not royal blood. Her family was wealthy, certainly, but they were courtiers, not royalty. They were the people who served power, not the people who held it. Her father sent her to the continent when she was young, first to the Netherlands and then to France. For 7 years, she lived at the French court, serving Queen Claude, the wife of King Francis I. And those 7 years changed everything about her. She learned to dance in the French style. She learned to dress in continental fashions that made English ladies look provincial by comparison. She learned the art of conversation, the delicate balance of flirtation and propriety, the way powerful women like Marguerite d'Angoulême and Louise de Savoy wielded influence through charm and intelligence. When she returned to England in 1522, at around 21 years old, she was something the English court had never quite seen before. Dark-haired, with striking eyes and a slender neck, she wasn't classically beautiful in the way people expected, but she was magnetic. French to her fingertips, witty, sophisticated, capable of original thinking in a court that often rewarded women for being decorative and quiet. She joined Queen Catherine of Aragon's household as a lady-in-waiting. Her older sister Mary was already there, already the king's mistress, already discarded after he tired of her. Anne watched that happen. She saw how quickly Henry VIII moved on, how little he valued women who gave themselves to him without demanding more. And she learned the lesson that would define her life: never settle for less than everything. By 1526, Henry VIII had noticed her. He started writing her letters, passionate declarations of love and desire. He wanted her as his mistress, the way he had wanted Mary. But Anne refused. She actually refused the King of England. The letters Henry wrote to Anne during this period still survive, 17 of them, kept in the Vatican archives. They're extraordinary documents, revealing a side of Henry that history doesn't often show. He begged. He pleaded. He declared that his heart belonged to Anne alone. In one letter, he wrote that he had been struck by the dart of love for over a year, suffering without knowing if his affection would be returned. In another, he promised that if she would give herself completely to him, he would take her as his only mistress, casting off all others. He drew pictures in the margins, hearts with their initials intertwined. Henry VIII, the king who would become famous for his cruelty, drawing hearts like a lovesick teenager. But Anne's response, or lack of it, drove him to distraction. When his advances became too insistent, she left court and retreated to her family's home at Castle in Kent. She didn't answer his letters. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in being another forgotten conquest. And here's where Anne showed the first glimpse of the strategic thinking that would define her. She wasn't just protecting her virtue, though that mattered in a world where a woman's reputation was everything. She was reading the situation, understanding that Henry's obsession with her grew stronger the more she resisted. She had seen what happened to women who said yes too quickly. They became temporary diversions. But a woman who said no, who held out for marriage. That was something Henry had never encountered before, and it fascinated him. The king wasn't accustomed to rejection. and Anne's refusal only intensified his obsession. He pursued her for 7 years. 7 years of letters, of promises, of slowly becoming convinced that marrying Anne Boleyn was not just what he wanted, but what God wanted for England. Because by this point, Henry had a problem. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. He was desperate for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, and Catherine, in her 40s now, was unlikely to provide one. Anne represented a fresh start, youth, fertility, the possibility of sons. But more than that, she represented something Henry had never experienced before: intellectual partnership. She debated theology with him. She introduced him to reformist ideas about the church. She treated him not as a distant king, but as a man whose mind could be engaged as well as his heart. And so Henry did the unthinkable. He decided to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne instead. The long wait for a crown. What followed was 6 years of waiting. 6 years while Henry's advisors tried to convince the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. 6 years of Anne being in this strange limbo, neither mistress nor wife, gaining enemies at court with every passing month. The wait was excruciating. Anne was in her late 20s when Henry first proposed marriage. By the time they actually wed, she was in her early 30s, her prime childbearing years slipping away, while diplomats and churchmen argued about the validity of Henry's first marriage. Catherine's supporters hated her. They saw her as a scheming upstart who had bewitched the king with dark arts. Rumours circulated that she had 6 fingers on one hand, a mark of the devil. It wasn't true, but that didn't stop people from believing it. They called her the concubine, the whore, never the queen in waiting. The common people hated her too. Catherine was beloved, the daughter of Spanish royalty, a symbol of England's alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. She had been queen for over 20 years. She had endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, trying to give England an heir. She was pious, dignified, exactly what a queen should be. Anne was just a courtier's daughter who had broken up a marriage. She dressed in French fashions when England and France were often enemies. She was too educated, too opinionated, too different from what English people expected. But Anne held firm. She had come too far to back down now. She had refused to be Henry's mistress, and she wouldn't accept anything less than marriage. Even when it became clear that the Pope would never grant the annulment, even when Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England after the king, failed to secure it and fell from grace as a result. Wolsey had been Henry's chief minister for nearly 20 years, but he couldn't deliver the annulment, and Henry blamed him. Wolsey was stripped of his offices, his property, his power. He died on his way to face charges of treason, broken and ruined. And Anne got the blame for his fall, even though it was Henry who had destroyed him. This was a pattern Anne would see repeated throughout her years of waiting. Anyone who stood in the way of Henry's desire to marry her was removed. Bishops who questioned the annulment found themselves in trouble. Courtiers who supported Catherine lost their positions. Henry was reshaping the entire political landscape of England to make room for Anne. And through it all, Anne had to maintain her position. Not quite a mistress, not yet a wife. She had to keep Henry interested without giving him what he wanted. She had to fend off her enemies at court while building alliances with people who could help her. She had to present herself as worthy of being queen while knowing that half the country thought she was a nobody who had gotten above her station. Henry grew impatient. In 1532, he made Anne the Marquess of Pembroke, giving her a title and income in her own right. It was unprecedented, a king elevating a woman to the nobility on her own merit, and it signalled his commitment to her. even as their situation seemed impossible. Then, sometime in late 1532, Anne finally gave herself to Henry. She became pregnant, and suddenly, everything had to move very quickly. They married in secret in January 1533, while Henry was still technically married to Catherine. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's first marriage invalid in May, and on June 1st, 1533, 6 months pregnant, Anne was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. It should have been her triumph. The girl from Kent, who had held out for marriage, who had refused to be a mistress, who had forced the King of England to break with Rome and establish the Church of England, was now queen. But the coronation was strangely subdued. The crowds that lined the streets to watch the procession were mostly silent. No one cheered. They had loved Catherine, and they weren't ready to accept this French-educated woman who had replaced her. 3 months later, Anne gave birth. But the child wasn't the son everyone expected. It was a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. And that's when the clock started ticking on Anne's time as queen, when the fairy tale soured. Henry had broken with Rome for Anne. He had defied the Pope, created a new church, made enemies across Europe, all because he believed Anne would give him sons. Plural, strong, healthy boys who would secure the Tudor line for generations. Elizabeth was a disappointment. Not to history, of course. Elizabeth would grow up to be one of England's greatest monarchs. But in 1533, to a king desperate for male heirs, a daughter was a failure. Anne knew it. She could see Henry's face when Elizabeth was born. The prepared announcement declaring the birth of a prince had to be hastily changed to read princess. The elaborate tournaments planned to celebrate a son were quietly cancelled. But Anne was young, only in her early 30s. There would be other children. She got pregnant again in 1534. That pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Then again in 1535. Another miscarriage. And with each failed pregnancy, Henry's affection cooled a little more. The charm that had captivated him during their courtship started to irritate him. She spoke her mind, argued with him about policy, involved herself in court politics. During the chase, he had found this exciting. Now that she was his wife, he found it exhausting. Anne had a temper. She wasn't the meek, obedient wife that Tudor society expected queens to be. She challenged Henry. She made demands. She tried to influence his decisions on everything from foreign policy to religious reform to who should receive court appointments. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, had loved Anne when they were young. They had even been secretly betrothed before his father and Cardinal Wolsey forced them apart. Now, years later, Percy would sit on the jury that condemned her to death. When the verdict was read, he collapsed and had to be carried from the room. But that tragedy was still in the future. In 1535, Anne still thought she could salvage her position. She was the queen. She had given Henry one child. She would give him more. She just needed time. Then, in January 1536, 2 things happened that sealed her fate. First, Catherine of Aragon died. The woman Henry had set aside, the wife he had claimed was never truly his wife, was gone. And with her death came a terrible realization for Anne. While Catherine lived, Henry couldn't get rid of Anne without admitting his first marriage had been valid all along. But now Catherine was dead. Now he was free to claim that both marriages had been mistakes, that God had never blessed either union. Second, Anne had another miscarriage. This one was particularly devastating because the child appeared to be male, and she was nearly 4 months along. Henry convinced himself it was a sign. He told Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, that he had been seduced into the marriage by witchcraft. that Anne had trapped him through spells and deception. It was absurd, of course. Henry had pursued Anne for 7 years. He had torn the country apart for her. But he needed a way out, and he needed it to be someone else's fault, never his own. By February 1536, Henry had a new woman in his sights. Jane Seymour was one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. She was quiet, demure, everything Anne was not. And Henry, who had once loved Anne's spirit and intelligence, now wanted the opposite. Jane's brothers understood what was happening. They moved into royal quarters at Greenwich to maintain propriety, while Jane caught the king's attention. And Anne watched it all unfold, knowing exactly what it meant, because she had been in Jane's position once, the other woman waiting for her moment. But Anne still thought she had leverage. She was the queen, the mother of Princess Elizabeth. Surely Henry wouldn't discard her the way he had discarded Catherine. Surely her position was secure. She was wrong. 17 days to destruction. April 1536. A musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and taken to Thomas Cromwell's house. Smeaton was a low-born man who had risen through his musical talent to perform at court. He had no power, no protectors. And under pressure, possibly under torture, though the records are unclear, he confessed to having an affair with Queen Anne. It was exactly what Cromwell needed. For months, he had been quietly building a case against Anne, not because she was guilty of anything, but because Henry wanted to be rid of her, and Cromwell understood that his own position depended on giving the king what he wanted. Anne had made an enemy of Cromwell by disagreeing with him about church policy. She wanted the money from dissolved monasteries to go to education and charity. Cromwell wanted it for the royal treasury. That kind of disagreement could be overlooked when the Queen was secure in her position. But now that Henry had turned against her, Cromwell had no reason to protect her. Smeaton's confession opened the door. Suddenly, other men were arrested. Henry Norris, one of the king's closest friends and a powerful courtier, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and most shocking of all, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The charges were adultery, incest in George's case, and conspiracy to kill the king. If the charges were true, they were treason, and treason meant death. On May 1st, there was a jousting tournament at Greenwich. Anne attended, sitting beside the king. Her brother George participated in the tournament. Henry Norris, her accused lover, rode as well. Everything seemed normal. Then, in the middle of the day, Henry suddenly stood up and left. No explanation, no farewell to Anne. He just rode away from Greenwich, and he never saw her again. It was a moment that must have sent ice through Anne's veins. Kings didn't just leave tournaments without explanation. Something was terribly wrong. The next day, May 2nd, Anne was arrested. They came for her at Greenwich Palace in the afternoon. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was among the men who delivered the charges. The same uncle who had supported her rise, who had benefited from her position as queen, now stood before her, reading accusations of adultery, incest, and treason. They accused her of being unfaithful with multiple men, of plotting with them to murder the king, of betraying her marriage, her crown, and England itself. The list of her supposed lovers was read aloud. Mark Smeaton, the musician; Henry Norris, the king's trusted friend; William Brereton; Francis Weston; and George Boleyn, her own brother. The charge of incest was based on testimony that she and George had been alone together too often, that they had shared private jokes and conversations inappropriate for siblings. Anne denied everything. She was horrified, confused, terrified. These were men she knew, men who served at court. The idea that she had committed adultery with any of them was absurd. The idea that she had plotted to kill Henry was impossible. She loved her daughter Elizabeth. She would never do anything that would endanger her child's future. But her protests made no difference. She was taken by barge down the Thames to the Tower of London, entering through the same private gate where, just 3 years earlier, she had stayed before her coronation. Then, she had been preparing to become queen, staying in royal apartments decorated for her comfort, attended by ladies chosen for their loyalty to her. Now, she was a prisoner, and the ladies assigned to watch her were there to report every word she said back to Thomas Cromwell. The constable of the Tower, William Kingston, recorded her reactions in letters that have survived. She asked him whether she would be put in a dungeon. He assured her she would have the royal apartments. She asked about the men who had been arrested. Were they in the Tower too? Yes, Kingston told her. All of them. Anne broke down. She alternated between calm and hysteria. She talked constantly, perhaps thinking that if she explained herself, if she protested her innocence loudly enough, someone would listen. She asked Kingston to remind the king of all the good times they had shared. She spoke of her daughter. She wondered aloud how the charges could possibly be true when she could prove she hadn't been in the same location as some of these men at the times the affairs supposedly occurred. Kingston wrote everything down, but he couldn't help her. No one could help her. Anne knew what was happening. She had lived at court long enough to understand how these things worked. When the king wanted someone gone, they were gone. Evidence could be manufactured. Witnesses could be found. Confessions could be extracted. But she also clung to hope. Surely Henry wouldn't go through with this. Surely someone would speak up for her. Surely the truth would come out. She didn't understand yet that the truth didn't matter. Henry wanted to marry Jane Seymour, and Anne Boleyn was in the way. That was all the truth that mattered now, the trial that was never in doubt. On May 12th, the accused men were tried first: Smeaton, Norris, Brereton, and Weston. A grand jury found them guilty based on Smeaton's confession and testimony from other court members who claimed to have witnessed suspicious behaviour. The evidence was thin, contradictory, filled with dates when Anne could prove she was elsewhere. None of it mattered. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. George Boleyn was tried separately on May 15th. The evidence against him was particularly weak. The main charge was that he had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with his sister. The proof? A comment Anne had made to George's wife about Henry's problems in the bedroom. That's all it took. A private conversation between women, twisted into evidence of incest and treason. George defended himself eloquently. He pointed out the absurdity of the charges, the lack of real evidence. The jury convicted him anyway. Anne's trial came on the same day, May 15th. It was held in the Great Hall of the Tower. More than 2,000 people crowded in to watch. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided. The jury included men who owed everything to the king, men who knew what verdict was expected of them. Among them was Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the man who had loved her when they were young, whose secret betrothal to her had been broken up by Cardinal Wolsey and the king. Now he sat in judgment of her, his face pale, his hands trembling. Anne was brought into the hall and allowed to sit, a courtesy given to her rank. She wore a dark gown, her hair covered, and she faced the men who would decide whether she lived or died. The charges were read: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother; conspiracy to murder the king; mocking the king's poetry and musical abilities; planning to marry one of her lovers after the king's death. Anne responded to each charge with dignity. She denied them all. She pointed out that she could prove she wasn't even in the same place as some of the men at the times these supposed encounters occurred. She reminded them that she was the Queen of England, crowned and anointed, the mother of the Princess Elizabeth. None of it made any difference. After brief deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was traditional for treason committed by a woman. Anne would be burned alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. When Henry Percy heard the verdict, he collapsed. They had to carry him out of the hall, but the others on the jury showed no such emotion. They had done what the king wanted. That was all that mattered. 2 days later, on May 17th, the men were executed. George Boleyn went to his death proclaiming his innocence, but admitting to sins of pride and worldliness. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton followed. All beheaded on Tower Hill in front of a crowd. Anne was still alive in her apartments, waiting for her own sentence to be carried out. Kingston reported that she seemed oddly calm, almost eager to have it over with. She made dark jokes about her execution. She said she heard the executioner was very good and she had a little neck, then laughed at her own gallows humour. The day before her execution, Archbishop Cranmer declared her marriage to Henry null and void. The marriage for which England had broken with Rome, for which Catherine of Aragon had died in exile, for which the entire religious structure of the country had been overturned, was declared invalid. Which meant Elizabeth was now a bastard. Which meant Anne had never truly been queen. Which meant everything she had fought for, waited for, sacrificed for, was retroactively erased. But it also meant something else. It meant the charges of adultery made no sense. If she had never been married to Henry, how could she have committed adultery against him? If the marriage was invalid, how could plotting to marry someone else be treason? The logic didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that Henry wanted to marry Jane Seymour, and Anne Boleyn needed to die the last morning. May 19th, 1536. Anne woke early in the royal apartments of the Tower. She had expected to die the day before, but the execution had been delayed. The swordsman Henry had hired from France had been late arriving, or perhaps Henry was still deciding something, whether to commute her sentence, whether to allow her to be buried in consecrated ground. Anne took communion that morning. Her almoner, John Skipp, performed the service. And before receiving the sacrament, Anne swore once more that she was innocent of the charges against her. She had been told she would die at 8 in the morning, but 8 o'clock came and went. The scaffold wasn't ready. The crowd wasn't assembled yet. Kingston had to tell her there would be another delay. She accepted the news calmly, though witnesses noted she showed signs of exhaustion. She had been awake all night. The women assigned to watch her in the Tower weren't her friends. They had been chosen for their loyalty to the king, not to Anne. But she asked them not to weep for her. She reminded them of her innocence. She told them she had made her peace with God. At 9 o'clock, Kingston came to tell her it was time. Anne was led out to Tower Green, the private area within the Tower walls where the scaffold had been erected. This wasn't a public execution. Henry had made sure of that. The first execution of an English queen couldn't be a spectacle for the masses, but there was still a crowd. Court officials, foreign ambassadors, about 1,000 people in total, there to witness history. Anne wore a dark grey gown with a crimson kirtle underneath and an ermine mantle. Her hair was bound up under a linen coif, covered by a headdress. She walked steadily to the scaffold, her composure remarkable for someone about to die. She asked permission to address the crowd. It was granted. And what she said in those final moments has been recorded by several witnesses who were there. She spoke carefully, knowing her words would be reported back to Henry, knowing that any criticism of the king could endanger her daughter Elizabeth. She submitted herself to the law, she said, and to the judgment that had been passed. She asked people to judge her kindly and to pray for the king. She called Henry the most gentle and merciful prince that ever was. Whether she meant it, or whether it was bitter irony, we'll never know. But she praised him. She protected her daughter by refusing to challenge the king who had condemned her. Then she knelt. The executioner, an expert swordsman brought from France specifically for this task, approached. Anne's ladies removed her headdress so her neck was bare. She spoke her final prayer aloud, committing her soul to Christ. The executioner had concealed his sword in the straw nearby. While Anne was still praying, he retrieved it. One of his assistants called out to distract her. She turned her head slightly. The sword swung, a single clean blow. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was dead. She was around 35 years old. She had been queen for 3 years. She had been on trial for 17 days. Her body and head were placed in an arrow chest, the only coffin available. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, with little ceremony and less dignity. 11 days later, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. What remains? The story of Anne Boleyn's fall is brutal in its efficiency. 17 days from arrest to execution. Charges fabricated, evidence thin, verdict predetermined. The men who had been her supposed lovers died denying their guilt. She died proclaiming her innocence. And Henry married the woman he had wanted all along before the month was out. Every historian who has examined the evidence since agrees. Anne was innocent. The charges were invented to give Henry legal cover for what he wanted to do anyway. Get rid of a wife who couldn't give him sons and marry someone new. But why did it work? How did a queen, crowned and anointed, end up on a scaffold based on such flimsy accusations? Part of it was Anne herself. She had made enemies. She had been too outspoken, too confident, too unwilling to play the role of submissive wife. The people who had resented her rise to power were happy to help engineer her fall. Part of it was circumstance. Catherine of Aragon's death removed the political complication that had protected Anne. If Henry had tried to be rid of Anne while Catherine lived, it would have suggested his first marriage had been valid all along. But with Catherine dead, he could claim both marriages were mistakes without invalidating his actions. Part of it was Henry's paranoia and narcissism. He couldn't accept that the failure to produce a male heir might be his fault. Medical science suggests Henry may have had a condition that made male children unlikely to survive, possibly related to a jousting injury. But Henry blamed Anne, and then convinced himself she must have used witchcraft to trap him. And part of it was Thomas Cromwell's ruthless efficiency. Once he understood that Henry wanted Anne gone, he manufactured a case that would stand up legally, even if it wouldn't stand up to honest scrutiny. He used torture, or the threat of it, to extract confessions. He found witnesses willing to testify to seeing suspicious glances and conversations. He built a case out of nothing and made it stick. Anne never had a chance. From the moment Mark Smeaton was arrested, the outcome was certain. The trial was theatre. The verdict was decided before it started. But there's something else worth considering. Her refusal to settle for being a mistress, her insistence on marriage, showed incredible strength and calculation. But it also made her threatening. A woman who demanded that much, who held out for that much, was dangerous in Henry's eyes. Her intelligence and her willingness to involve herself in politics made her fascinating to Henry during their courtship. But once she was queen, those same qualities made her difficult to manage. She argued about policy. She had opinions. She tried to influence the king's decisions. In another century, or with a different king, those qualities might have been valued. But in Tudor England, with Henry VIII, They became liabilities once his affection cooled. And there's a terrible irony in how it ended. Anne refused to be Henry's mistress because she saw what happened to women who settled for less. Mary Boleyn had been cast aside without a second thought. Anne wanted marriage, legitimacy, security. But in the end, the security was an illusion. Henry cast aside his wife as easily as he had cast aside his mistresses. More easily, perhaps, because he could use the law to do it. He could call it justice instead of cruelty. The daughter Anne left behind, Elizabeth, lived her whole life knowing what had happened to her mother. She saw how quickly Henry had moved on, how little Anne's position had protected her. Maybe that's why Elizabeth never married, why she refused to give any man that kind of power over her. Elizabeth became the greatest monarch of her age, reigning for 45 years, presiding over a golden age of English culture and power. The daughter Henry had been so disappointed by, the baby whose birth had started the clock on Anne's downfall, vindicated her mother's memory in ways Anne could never have imagined. But Anne didn't live to see any of that. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, all she knew was that she was about to die for crimes she hadn't committed, condemned by a king she had once loved, in front of a crowd that had never wanted her as queen. The French swordsman stepped forward. Anne closed her eyes and began to pray. And in that moment, before the sword fell, Anne Boleyn was no longer the calculating woman who had held out for a crown. She was no longer the queen who had failed to produce an heir. She was no longer the accused adulteress or the supposed traitor. She was just a woman in her 30s, about to die, asking God for mercy in a world that had shown her none. The sword swung, and England's second queen, the woman who had changed the course of religious history, the mother of Elizabeth I, was gone. Her story should have ended there. A cautionary tale about ambition and the dangers of falling from royal favour. But instead, Anne Boleyn became something more. A symbol, a mystery. A woman whose true character has been debated for nearly 5 centuries. Was she the scheming seductress that Henry's supporters painted? Or was she the innocent victim of a king's cruelty and Cromwell's machinations? Was she the passionate reformer who helped bring Protestantism to England? Or was she simply a woman trying to survive in a world that gave her very few options? Probably all of those things. Probably none of them. The real Anne Boleyn is lost to us, buried under centuries of propaganda and counter-propaganda, of novels and films and plays that have made her into whatever each generation needs her to be. But what we know for certain is this. She was born into a world that told her she could rise only so far. She refused to accept those limits. She reached for the highest position a woman could hold. And when she got there, when she wore the crown and sat on the throne, the same world that had allowed her rise destroyed her for daring to want so much. From crown to scaffold in 17 days. From queen to prisoner to corpse before the month was out. It's one of the most dramatic falls in British history, and it happened because Anne Boleyn, in the end, was just as mortal, just as vulnerable, just as powerless as any other woman in Tudor England. The crown couldn't save her. The throne couldn't protect her. When the king wanted her gone, she was gone. That's the brutal truth at the heart of her story. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Because Anne's story reminds us that power is always conditional, that success can evaporate overnight, that everything you build can be torn down by forces beyond your control. She lost everything: her crown, her freedom, her reputation, her life. But she's not forgotten. 500 years later, we're still talking about her, still trying to understand her, still moved by the tragedy of a woman who reached for everything and lost it all. If you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. February 4th, 1997. The Paris Ritz Pool. Pamela Harriman takes her morning swim. Within minutes, she's unconscious in an ambulance racing to the American hospital. 24 hours later, the 76-year-old US ambassador to France would be dead. The woman who had whispered in the ears of presidents and prime ministers for half a century was gone. But when tributes poured in from Washington, Paris, and London, the world would finally reckon with who Pamela Harriman really was. Something far more complicated than the headlines suggested. A country girl with no prospects. The year was 1920, and England was still catching its breath after the Great War. In the rolling hills of Dorset, at an estate called Minturn Magna, a baby girl was born to the 11th Baron Digby and his wife. They named her Pamela Beryl Digby. She was the eldest child, which in another family might have meant something. But this was England, and titles passed to sons, not daughters. Pamela grew up in that grand old house with governesses and expectations, but no real future to speak of. Her younger brother would inherit everything. She would get a good education, some Polish, and then she would be expected to marry well. That was the deal for girls like her. She wasn't a great beauty, not in the classical sense. Red-haired, with pale skin and a tendency toward plumpness, but there was something about her even then, a brightness in her eyes, a way of listening that made people feel important. She watched and learned, even as a child, how the world really worked. It wasn't about what you knew, it was about who you knew and what you could do for them. By 16, her formal education was over. She took a job as a translator at the Foreign Office in London, feeling like what she later called a real country bumpkin. The city overwhelmed her at first, but Pamela was nothing if not adaptable. She started accepting invitations, attending parties, making herself useful, and she waited for her moment. That moment came in September 1939. War had just been declared. At one of those parties that seemed so frivolous under the circumstances, she was introduced to a man named Randolph Churchill. He was 28, the son of Winston Churchill, who wasn't Prime Minister yet, but would be soon. Randolph was loud, charming in his way, and absolutely convinced he was going to die in the war. He proposed to her that very night. 8 women received similar proposals from Randolph that week. He wanted a wife and an heir before he shipped out. Most of the women laughed it off. Pamela said yes. They were married on October 4th, 1939. She was 19 years old. People tried to warn her. Randolph drank too much. He gambled. He had a temper. He was, by all accounts, impossible to live with. But Pamela saw something else. She saw the Churchill name. She saw access to power at a moment when the world was about to crack open. And she walked into that marriage with her eyes wide open. 10 months later, she gave birth to a son. They named him Winston, after his grandfather. And just like that, 19-year-old Pamela Digby Churchill became the mother of Winston Churchill's namesake grandson. The timing couldn't have been better. In May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Pamela, still practically a teenager, moved into 10 Downing Street. And that's when her real education began. Wartime. London and the art of influence. Randolph was sent to Cairo in February 1941. He managed to gamble away thousands of pounds on the boat journey alone, then wrote to his young wife expecting her to cover his debts. Pamela was left in London with a baby, creditors pounding on the door, and a war raging overhead. She could have crumbled. Instead, she took a job at the Ministry of Supply for £12 a week. She sold her wedding presents, She sold her jewellery, and she kept it all secret from her in-laws because she understood something crucial about the Churchills. They valued discretion. They valued loyalty. And they had no time for people who couldn't handle their own problems. But more than that, Pamela discovered she had a talent. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, genuinely liked her. His wife Clementine often pleaded illness and avoided social obligations. Pamela stepped in. She attended dinners. She played cards with Winston late into the night. She listened to the conversations, absorbed the strategies, learned how decisions were really made. Winston trusted her in ways he never trusted his own son. Randolph couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. But Pamela? She was a vault. And in wartime London, that made her invaluable. Then, in March 1941, an American arrived. His name was Averell Harriman. He was 49 years old, married, and President Roosevelt had sent him to oversee the Lend-Lease program, America's way of supporting Britain without officially entering the war. The whole Churchill family rolled out the red carpet. And when Harriman's eyes landed on the 20-year-old Mrs. Churchill with her red hair and her knowing smile, something shifted. Harriman wasn't like the British men Pamela had known. He was a railroad heir, son of one of America's great fortunes. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never had to prove himself to anyone. But more than that, he represented something crucial. America wasn't in the war yet. Britain desperately needed them to join. And here was Roosevelt's personal envoy, the man who would decide how much aid Britain received, how quickly it arrived, whether the relationship would deepen or cool. Winston Churchill understood immediately what this meant. The Americans needed to be courted, and Pamela, with her youth and charm and increasingly sharp political instincts, was perfectly positioned to help. Their affair began during one of the worst Luftwaffe raids on London. They met at the Dorchester Hotel while the building shook and shrapnel rained down on the streets outside. The next morning, people spotted them walking hand in hand across Horse Guards Parade, surveying the destruction together. It was bold, it was public, and it sent a message to everyone watching. Pamela Churchill and Averell Harriman were together, and the Churchills approved. With Harriman's support, she moved into a flat in Grosvenor Square, the heart of American expatriate London. She began hosting dinners, facilitating introductions, listening carefully to every conversation. Suddenly, she had become essential to the Anglo-American alliance. Pamela had found her purpose. And it wasn't what anyone expected. She became a conduit. Harriman would share American concerns, and Pamela would pass them to Churchill. Churchill would express British needs, and Pamela would whisper them to Harriman. Information flowed through her bedroom like water through a channel. It wasn't just pillow talk. It was intelligence gathering of the highest order. The affair was an open secret. Winston and Clementine Churchill knew. They approved, because it was working. British warships were being repaired in American ports. Aid was flowing. Harriman, who had arrived somewhat skeptical about Britain's chances, became one of the most zealous pro-British advocates in Roosevelt's administration. But Pamela wasn't satisfied with just one powerful American. There was Edward R. Murrow, the CBS broadcaster, whose radio reports from London were shaping American public opinion. There was John Hay Whitney, future ambassador to Britain. There was General Frederick Anderson, head of the US Bomber Command. She managed these relationships with precision, never letting one interfere with another, always maintaining her discretion. People later said she received 3 separate letters from 3 separate participants at the Yalta Conference. That wasn't luck. That was Pamela Churchill operating at the peak of her powers, understanding that in war, as in everything else, relationships were currency. William Paley, The CBS founder, who was briefly in her orbit, later said she was the greatest courtesan of the century. He meant it as a compliment, but that word, courtesan, would follow her for the rest of her life. And the question nobody could quite answer was this: was she using these men? Or were they using her? Or was it something more complicated, a genuine exchange where everyone got what they needed? The war ended. Churchill lost the election. Randolph came back from Cairo, discovered his wife's affairs, and flew into a rage. But by then it was over anyway. They divorced in 1946. Pamela kept the Churchill name. She was 26 years old, with a young son and no money of her own. Her wartime usefulness had expired. And that's when things got interesting. Paris. Love and lessons in loss. Harriman had made it clear he would never divorce his wife, so Pamela moved to Paris. If she couldn't marry power, she would find it another way. She rented an apartment and started over. Paris in the late 1940s was breathing again after years of occupation. The cafes were full. Artists and writers crowded the left bank. And Pamela, with her connections and her Churchill name, found herself welcomed into a world of wealth and sophistication she had only glimpsed before. She was still young, just 26 when she arrived. Still beautiful, though her figure had changed after childbirth and the stress of the war years. But she had something more valuable than beauty now. She had experience. She knew how to make powerful men feel understood. She knew how to keep secrets. She knew how to be useful. The late 1940s and 1950s in Paris were a whirlwind. There was Prince Ali Khan, son of the Aga Khan and one of the richest men in the world. There was Alfonso de Portago, the Spanish racing driver who would die in a crash at the Mille Miglia in 1957. And then there was Gianni Agnelli. Agnelli was different from the others. He was only a year younger than Pamela, which meant they were peers in a way she had never been with Harriman or the older men she had known. He was heir to the Fiat fortune, but more than that, he was beautiful. Dark-haired, elegant, with a casual sophistication that came from being born into one of Europe's great industrial families. They met in 1948, and for the next 5 years, Pamela was happier than she had ever been. They travelled together. They attended parties in Rome and Venice and the south of France. They were photographed together, a glamorous couple living the life that ordinary people could only dream about. Pamela later said those 5 years with Agnelli were the happiest of her life, and you can hear it in her voice when she talked about him, even decades later. This wasn't just strategy. This wasn't just access to wealth. She loved him, genuinely, completely, in a way that left her vulnerable. She even converted to Catholicism, hoping it might convince him to marry her. But Agnelli's family had other plans. Italian aristocracy married Italian aristocracy. And no matter how charming Pamela was, no matter how perfect they seemed together, she would always be the English divorcee with a complicated past. In August 1952, at a party, she saw him. Gianni was standing in a corner, his arms around another woman, Anne-Marie d'Estainville, young and French, and everything Pamela suddenly realized she could never be. She watched for a moment, taking in the scene. Then she left. Later that night, Agnelli drove d'Estainville home. His car crashed. His leg was shattered so badly that doctors wondered if he would ever walk normally again. And Pamela, hearing the news, did what she always did. She rushed to the hospital. She stayed by his bedside through the worst of it. She nursed him through his recovery, through the pain and the frustration and the long months of rehabilitation. When he was finally well enough to talk seriously, they agreed together to end the relationship. That's how Pamela told it anyway. Mutual, civilized, no drama. But you have to wonder what it cost her, that conversation. because Agnelli went on to marry Princess Morella Caracciolo di Castagneto, and Pamela went on to the next man. But something had broken in her during those months. The belief that love alone might be enough. The hope that she could build a life that wasn't fundamentally transactional. After Agnelli, she never made that mistake again. Rothschild kept her in style through the 1950s. They attended parties. She became a fixture in Paris society, moving through salons with Christian Dior and Jean Cocteau. But it was the same pattern. These European men would support their mistresses beautifully, shower them with gifts and attention. They just wouldn't marry them. When Queen Elizabeth made her first state visit to France in 1957, the British ambassador's wife refused to let Pamela attend any embassy functions. The woman's exact words were reported to be, "I will not have that tart in this embassy." Pamela got the message. Europe was a dead end. It was time to try America again. She set her sights on Leland Hayward, a Broadway producer who had made a fortune with shows like South Pacific and The Sound of Music, becoming American. Hayward was married when Pamela met him, but she was patient. She waited. And on the day his divorce became final in 1960, they married in Carson City, Nevada. Pamela became Mrs. Hayward and moved to New York. Finally, she had arrived. Hayward's money bought them a townhouse in Manhattan and an estate in Westchester County called Haywire. She was meeting stars, producers, directors. She was becoming an American citizen. She was, at 40 years old, building something that looked like respectability. But Hayward's health began to fail. He suffered a stroke. Pamela nursed him, just as she had nursed Agnelli years before. For once, she wasn't angling for anything. This was just life, with its complications and its demands. Hayward died in March 1971. The day after his funeral, Pamela arranged to meet with Averell Harriman. Harriman was 79 years old. His wife had recently died. He was one of the grand old men of American politics, a former governor of New York, former ambassador to the Soviet Union and Britain, a man who had been present at Yalta and Potsdam and all the great moments of 20th century diplomacy. And 30 years after their wartime affair, he was still, apparently, in love with Pamela Churchill. They married 6 months later. Some people said it was the first time Averell Harriman had truly been in love in his life. He certainly acted like it. They bought a Georgetown townhouse and filled it with impressionist paintings. They bought an estate in Virginia. They bought a private jet. And Pamela, now Pamela Harriman, began her final transformation. She had spent her life in the orbit of powerful men. Now she would become powerful in her own right, rebuilding the Democratic Party. The 1980s were brutal for the Democratic Party. Ronald Reagan won in landslides, twice. The party was demoralized, broke, fractured. And into that chaos stepped Pamela Harriman with a simple idea: bring people together. The Georgetown house became something special during those years. Pamela had inherited Averell's art collection, his furniture, his entire aesthetic sense. But she added her own touches. Fresh flowers in every room, changed daily. Candles that created just the right atmosphere. Food prepared to each guest's preferences, because Pamela remembered everything about everyone. She started hosting gatherings at the Georgetown house, political action committee meetings that became known as PAMPAC. She raised money, millions of dollars, for Democratic candidates. But it wasn't just about writing checks. Pamela understood something that the professional political class had forgotten. Politics was personal. She would invite a mix of people to each dinner. Old guard senators who remembered FDR sitting next to young congressmen who had just won their first elections. Donors who had never been inside a Georgetown mansion talking strategy with campaign managers. journalists getting background information from administration officials. She orchestrated these evenings like symphonies, making sure everyone got something they needed. The dinners would start at 8, cocktails first, with Pamela moving through the room, greeting each guest personally, asking about their families, their districts, their concerns. Then dinner at a table that could seat 20, with place cards arranged so that the person on your left could help you with your biggest problem, and the person on your right could introduce you to the contact you desperately needed. And through it all, Pamela would be watching, listening, making mental notes about who clicked with whom, which issues were gaining traction, where the party needed to focus its energy. People came because of the paintings on the walls, the elegant dinners, the sense that you were at the center of something important. But they stayed because Pamela had learned, over 40 years of careful observation, how to make powerful people feel heard. She didn't dominate conversations. She asked questions. She remembered details. If you mentioned that your daughter was applying to colleges in March, Pamela would ask about it in June. If you were nervous about a vote coming up, she would call the morning of to wish you luck. She built relationships that outlasted any single political cycle. Joe Biden attended her salons. So did Al Gore, Dick Gephardt, Tom Daschle. Names that would define Democratic politics for the next 2 decades all passed through that Georgetown townhouse, eating Pamela's food, admiring her art, and absorbing her lessons about coalition building and patience. And then there was Bill Clinton, a young governor from Arkansas, charming and ambitious and rough around the edges. Pamela met him in the early 1980s and saw something. The same instinct that had drawn her to Harriman in 1941, the same sense for potential that had served her so well throughout her life. She introduced him to donors. She hosted events for him. She taught him how to work a room, how to make each person feel like the most important person present. And when he decided to run for president in 1992, Pamela was one of his earliest and most energetic supporters. The professionals thought he couldn't win. Too young, too inexperienced, too Southern. But Pamela had been around long enough to know that conventional wisdom was often wrong. She had seen Churchill come back from political exile. She had watched Kennedy charm his way past older, more qualified candidates. She knew that sometimes the long shot was actually the smart bet. Averell Harriman died in 1986. He left Pamela his entire fortune, $115 million. His children from previous marriages were furious. They accused her of mismanaging their trust funds, of making bad investments, of essentially stealing their inheritance. The lawsuit was vicious. It dragged on for years. Pamela eventually paid them $11 million to make it go away. She sold a Picasso, a Matisse, a Renoir. She sold property, and she moved on. Because Bill Clinton had won the presidency in 1992, and he hadn't forgotten who had helped him get there. Ambassador to France. The final act. In 1993, Bill Clinton appointed Pamela Harriman as United States Ambassador to France. She was 73 years old. It was her first formal job title in her entire life. The appointment raised eyebrows. Ambassadorships to France were usually reserved for career diplomats, or at least people with government experience. Pamela had neither. She had a resume that consisted of 3 marriages and a lifetime of attending parties. Critics said it was a reward for campaign donations, nothing more. They said she would embarrass the country. They predicted she would fail spectacularly. They were wrong. But she prepared for the role with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She spent hours with academic specialists on France. She met with State Department officials who had worked on French issues for decades. She studied the pressure points in the relationship, the historical grievances, the cultural differences that could make or break negotiations. She learned about agricultural subsidies, about film industry protections, about the French view of American power. She wasn't trying to become an expert in every detail. She was trying to understand the landscape well enough to know when to push and when to listen. And when she arrived in Paris in May 1993, she was ready. France in the mid-1990s was complicated for America. The Cold War had ended, which meant the old certainties about the transatlantic relationship no longer applied. France was asserting its independence more aggressively, questioning American leadership in NATO, pushing back on trade agreements. There were specific fights brewing over audiovisual services, with France trying to protect its film industry from Hollywood, over genetically modified crops, with French consumers worried about American agricultural practices, over NATO expansion, with France skeptical about bringing former Soviet bloc countries into the alliance. These weren't small issues. They went to the heart of how Europe and America would work together in the post-Cold War world. And they required someone who could navigate both Washington's desire for American leadership and Paris's need to preserve French identity. Pamela threw dinners that brought together officials at every level, from cabinet ministers to working-level bureaucrats. She didn't just talk to the foreign minister. She cultivated relationships with the people who wrote the policy papers, who sat in the interagency meetings, who would ultimately have to implement whatever agreements got reached. She paid attention to French officials who had never received attention before. The deputy minister who handled agricultural policy, the aide who drafted speeches for the president, the civil servant who had spent 30 years working on transatlantic issues. She made them feel seen, and they responded. One story captures how she worked. There was a dispute over intellectual property rights, specifically about software protection. American companies wanted stronger enforcement. French officials were resistant, worried about American dominance in the tech sector. The negotiations were stalled. The official American position was clear, but delivering it through normal diplomatic channels wasn't getting results. So Pamela invited the relevant French officials to a working dinner at the ambassador's residence. She seated the French technology minister next to a representative from an American software company who happened to be a Francophile who spoke fluent French. She put the French intellectual property expert across from someone from the US Patent Office who had worked in France early in his career. Over the course of the evening, with good wine and careful conversation, the Americans learned why the French were nervous. The French learned that the American position had some flexibility built in, and by the time dessert was served, the outlines of a compromise had emerged. That wasn't traditional diplomacy. That was Pamela's diplomacy. Personal, patient, focused on relationships rather than position papers. The Dayton Agreement, which ended the war in Bosnia, was signed in Paris in December 1995 during her tenure. Richard Holbrooke negotiated the actual terms, but Pamela created the environment that made Paris the right venue. She convinced President Chirac that hosting the signing would demonstrate French relevance in the post-Cold War security architecture. She arranged the logistics, the ceremonies, the photo opportunities that would make everyone feel like they had won something. When Holbrooke later talked about her role, he emphasized how she understood that big agreements required not just negotiation, but stage management. France needed to feel important. The parties to the agreement needed to feel honored, and the American administration needed to show that its diplomacy could deliver results. Pamela orchestrated all of that without ever taking center stage herself. Richard Holbrooke, the American diplomat who negotiated the Dayton Agreement, said of her, "She spoke the language, she knew the country, she knew its leadership. She was one of the best ambassadors that ever served the United States." President Jacques Chirac of France developed a genuine friendship with her. They met regularly. They talked strategy. When she made suggestions about how to handle delicate situations, he listened. But there were still the whispers, the jokes about her past, the questions about whether she really deserved the position. And Pamela, who had dealt with those whispers her entire life, mostly ignored them. She focused on the work. Until February 4th, 1997, the swim at the Ritz. She was staying at the Ritz Paris, as she often did. That morning, she went down to the pool for her daily swim. It was routine, something she had done hundreds of times. Somewhere in the water, something went wrong. A cerebral hemorrhage, massive and sudden. Staff pulled her from the pool. An ambulance rushed her to the American hospital in the suburb of Neuilly. For 24 hours, she hung on. Her deputy chief of mission stood vigil. Staff from the embassy gathered, many of them in tears. President Clinton was notified. So was President Chirac. On February 5th, 1997, Pamela Harriman died. She was 76 years old. The tributes came immediately. Clinton called her one of the most unusual and gifted people he had ever met. He credited her with helping him reach the Oval Office. Chirac announced he would posthumously award her France's highest honor, the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor. She was the first female foreign diplomat to receive it. Her funeral was held at Washington National Cathedral. 1,200 people attended, representing 40 countries. Clinton gave an 8-minute eulogy. Chirac sent a representative. Gianni Agnelli, the great love of her life from 40 years earlier, flew in to be there. And the obituaries, well, they were complicated. Some praised her as a pioneering woman who had navigated a man's world with intelligence and grace. Others resurrected every old rumor, every affair, every whispered accusation. The Washington Post questioned why she was being lauded so lavishly, as if she had done something momentous. But the people who had worked with her, who had watched her operate up close, told a different story. Her deputy in Paris said the embassy had never run better than when the two women were in charge. Diplomats who had sat in meetings with her talked about her preparation, her attention to detail, her ability to see solutions others had missed. She had been buried at Arden, the Harriman estate in New York, on February 14th. And in the weeks and months that followed, people started to reassess. Because stripped of the scandal and the gossip, what remained was a record of influence that spanned 3 countries and 5 decades. The woman behind the legend. She had been Winston Churchill's confidant during World War II, passing intelligence that helped shape the Anglo-American alliance. She had been a behind-the-scenes power broker in democratic politics, rebuilding a party that had lost its way. She had been an effective ambassador who strengthened relationships at a delicate moment. But she had also been a woman who made choices that society didn't quite know how to categorize. She had used her relationships with men to gain access to power. She had been unapologetic about it. And that made people uncomfortable. There's a moment in Pamela Harriman's story that keeps coming back. It's from the war years, when she was moving between Harriman and Murrow and Whitney, gathering information and passing it along. Someone who knew her then said she was privy to state secrets that could have changed the course of the war if leaked. But she never leaked them. Not once. Not even when it would have been fun to show off what she knew, because she understood that the moment she violated that trust, her access would end. And without access, she was nothing. That discipline, that understanding of how power really worked, defined her entire life. She knew the rules. She knew that powerful men needed someone they could talk to, someone who would listen without judgment, someone who would keep their secrets. And she provided that service. Was it transactional? Of course it was. But it was also genuine. The relationships she built lasted decades. Harriman carried a torch for her for 30 years before they finally married. Agnelli flew across the Atlantic to attend her funeral. These weren't just marks she had conned. These were people who genuinely cared about her. And maybe that's what made her so effective. She didn't see it as either-or. She could care about someone and also benefit from knowing them. She could be in love and also be strategic. Life, for Pamela, was never that simple. Her son Winston, who became a member of Parliament like his grandfather and great-grandfather before him, had a complicated relationship with his mother. She had left him with his grandparents for much of his childhood, while she pursued her life in Paris and New York. He resented her for that, but he also understood, perhaps better than most, what she had accomplished. The stepchildren who sued her over the inheritance eventually got their settlement, but even they had to admit that she had transformed their father's final years, given him joy and purpose when he might have just faded away. And the Democratic Party that she helped rebuild went on to win 3 of the next 4 presidential elections after her death. The connections she made, the infrastructure she built, the culture of fundraising and networking she established, all of that outlived her. So what do we make of Pamela Churchill Harriman? She was born in an England where women of her class had almost no options. She saw the limits of that life and decided to write her own rules. She used every tool available to her, including her relationships with men, to carve out a space for herself in rooms where women weren't supposed to be. She was criticized for it, mocked, called names that men in similar positions never faced. But she kept going. She adapted to every new decade, every new country, every new challenge. And in the end, she died doing what she loved, serving her adopted country in the city where she had once been the happiest, where she had discovered who she could be when she wasn't worried about what people thought. That morning at the Ritz, before she went down to the pool, she would have been planning her day, meetings to attend, dinners to host, phone calls to make. At 76, she was still working, still building relationships, still finding ways to be useful. The cerebral hemorrhage was sudden. Doctors said she probably didn't feel any pain. She slipped away in the hospital with the people who had worked alongside her standing nearby, crying for a boss who had taught them what real diplomacy looked like. President Chirac, at her memorial service, called her elegance itself. He said she was a peerless diplomat who had made the world a safer place. Those weren't empty words from a politician paying respects. Chirac had worked with her. He had seen what she could do. The real tragedy of Pamela Harriman's final chapter isn't that she died too soon. At 76, after the life she had lived, you could argue she had earned her rest. The tragedy is that it took her death for some people to finally see past the scandals, to recognize her genuine political intelligence and understanding of power. She saw how the world worked, and instead of complaining about it, she learned to work within it. And sometimes, when she had the chance, she changed it. She never became what society expected. She didn't marry young and settle down. She didn't stay quietly in the background. She didn't apologize for her ambitions or her appetites. She lived exactly the way she wanted to live, and she built a legacy that most career diplomats would envy. On February 5th, 1997, when the machines in that hospital room finally went quiet, the world lost someone who had been present at some of the most important moments of the 20th century. Someone who had whispered in the ears of prime ministers and presidents. Someone who had helped shape history, even if she never got to write the official reports. And maybe that's fitting. Because Pamela Harriman's power was never the kind that left an obvious trail. It was subtle, personal, based on trust and discretion and the kind of intelligence that can't be measured on a resume. But it was real, and it mattered. and the fact that she died in Paris, the city where she had once fallen in love with Gianni Agnelli, where she had transformed herself from a disgraced divorcee into a woman of influence, where she had learned that life could be beautiful and complicated and worth living on your own terms, feels almost poetic. She came from an England where she had no future. She ended up as an American ambassador, honoured by France, mourned by 1,200 people from around the world. Not bad for a girl who started out with nothing but red hair, a sharp mind, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations other people tried to place on her. The pool at the Ritz still operates today. People swim there, unaware that this is where one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century came to its end. And maybe that's appropriate too, because Pamela Harriman never wanted to be remembered for just one thing, one moment, one choice. She wanted to be remembered for all of it. The contradictions and the complexity, the scandals and the achievements, the love affairs and the diplomatic victories, the whole messy, brilliant, impossible life she had somehow managed to pull off. And when you look at it that way, when you step back far enough to see the full picture, what you find is a woman who refused to be limited by what the world told her she could be, who took every setback and turned it into an opportunity, who understood that power wasn't just about position or title, but about relationships and trust and knowing when to speak and when to listen. She spent 76 years proving that there was more than one way to matter, more than one path to influence, more than one way to leave your mark on history. And on that February morning in Paris, when everything ended too suddenly in the water, she had nothing left to prove. The woman who had started out as just another English debutante with no prospects had become someone whose death made presidents weep and whose life would be studied and debated for generations. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.